Okay, we're recording.
All right. Can you switch the video for me so I can see myself in the...
Oh, you want me to pin you? Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
Do I need to be on video as well?
No,
Definitely.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah, okay. He said yes. I'm not the boss here.
You are the boss, Michelle. Whoops, we're all being recorded. Hello, folks. My name's Seven Song. And this is part 2 of Herbal Street Medicine. And so the goals of these classes is pretty much to give you some tools and information to venture into protests and similar events, knowing some basic skills. So very importantly, I'm going to start off by saying this. If you really want to do healthcare at protests and similar and other events, you should go to a street medic training. Even if you're a medical professional, then you would go to what's called a bridge training. So it's important, I've been reminded of this, and I need to say this numerous times, that there's these classes, I'm hoping to do about 4 or 5 of them. And with them, you'll definitely gain some skills, hopefully gain some skills, learn some things. But when you're one-to-one with a human being, you really need to know. You need to know basic assessment. You know how to keep yourself out of trouble. You need to help other people. There is so much more at a protest than you might have at other first aid stations or other medical stations. So please try to find the place. I don't have any good recommendations right now. As I accrue them, I will send them to everybody. In Ithaca, for instance, Flame, our local activist street medic group, is starting to get together again. It's all more difficult because of COVID, which we'll get to in a minute. But please consider learning, going to like a 20-hour, 25-hour street medic training. There's many reasons to do that. One of my favorite reasons, I like the skills. Another reason to go, though, is you meet some really excellent people who are very devoted and want to help make change. All right. So some very basic info about me. My name is Seven Song. I'm a Russian Jew. The reason I say that over and over again, if you've ever wondered, is because people often think I'm another or different ethnicities. And this is what I am. This is an Eastern European Jew, second, third generation in the United States. That's all for there. I run an herb school called the Northeast School of Botanical Medicine. There are many excellent herb schools. There's really lots of great herb schools in the United States right now. You have lots of choices, not everywhere, but in many places. If you're interested in my school, just go to my website, which is sevensong.com. It's a very science-based herb school, very plant-focused, and that's enough of that. Something else that plays a big part of my life that I'm just going to mention because it plays a big part of my life, and that's the Ithaca Free Clinic. So I work as a clinical herbalist in a free clinic where all modalities are free. Not all modalities give medicine, but the herbalists, our medicines are free. They're still free, even, and now we deliver and carry them to people's houses if they live within a half hour of Ithaca. So that's just something, if you're interested in integrative herbal medicine and want to see a place, we've been open since 2006. We've been closed since mid-March. This is by far the longest, the only time we've ever been closed. So if you want to see more about the clinic, go to Ithaca Free Clinic. You're also welcome to come there as a patient or as a person to be seen by either medical people or myself. So there's lots more to this, but there's so much to cover today. I just want to say I'm so appreciative of Qiddist, who will be talking later today about whatever they speak about support, jail support, and many other topics. And also Linda Black Elk will be here and will also be speaking. So in order to round out the information in this program, I'm really hoping that more BIPOC folks want to join in and be a part of this discussion. If you do street medic work or protest support or anything closely related, if you want to get in contact with me, I think the more brown and black bodies, the more BIPOC people we have here, the more relevance it is to all the damage that's been being done to BIPOC people in the United States. And so if you have any questions, or if there's any way I can open this up and make it truly supportive for a collaborative environment for as many different voices to be here, I'd really appreciate it. So, so that's on to the next thing. I have lots of notes. I'm not a very organized thinker. I'm a very nonlinear thinker. And so I'll keep turning to the side to look at the notes on my other computer here. Very important. So I'm going to cover about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes worth of stuff, and then we'll go into the discussion at hand about herbs. But I want to just cover a few things. First, anybody who's rural or anybody who lives in tick territory, please be aware that ticks still exist and ticks still carry Lyme. Please check yourself regularly. It's not a time to let down our guard against Lyme. Of course, so many other things to have up our guard against, like police presences. But I just want to say, as far as someone who lives in tick territory, to be really cautious about that currently. Next, COVID-19 still exists, but it still exists. In the United States, some states more than others, but it's just everywhere. It's still, I have friends who are coming down with COVID, and you can just read reports on a regular basis. So the reason I'm saying this is you need to protect yourself if you go into a protest. This class, I'm not going to go into the details. There's really no really excellent way to protect yourself. I mean, wearing a mask can be very helpful, but if you're a street medic, you're often very hands-on with people. You can definitely glove up, mask up, wear protective clothing, but it's still out there. And so I just want to warn you that somehow doing excellent work and protesting the harassment of law enforcement, much more brutal harassment of law enforcement, that it's important for us to protect ourselves as much as possible. And of course, the higher the risk you are, the more you should protect yourself, but everybody is at risk. Everybody is at risk for COVID-19. So please be aware of that. One thing I'm going to talk about today is various medicines. So I want to discuss a few things that I talked about last time, just so, and you can just go to that recording. So I want to say what I discussed so you can go to the recording. And I also just want to say some new information. But one thing I talked about last recording or last week is I'm going to be talking about a lot of herbs today. Many of the herbs I use are tinctures, and they're in drinking alcohol, which is called ethanol. Ethanol is drinking alcohol. For many people, drinking alcohol, I'm just going to call it alcohol. Alcohol is one of the worst substances in their life. Many people are sober, and if you gave them a tincture without them knowing that you're giving them alcohol, they could start drinking again. It could also be against their faith or religion. And so that's a good reason to not do it. So as I've talked about many times, it's just an empty bottle right in front of me. But before you give anybody, any adult, a tincture, always just say, this has alcohol, is that okay? And if they say no, then hopefully you have other choices like glycerins or capsules in your first aid kit. So again, I talked about that very thoroughly previously. And so I just wanted to make sure, because that's one of the most important things that herbalists said. Don't say it's a tincture, is that okay, by the way? The word tincture is not a very commonly used word. It's a word used by herbalists, some people who do natural health care, but it's certainly not a word that many people think, oh, this has alcohol in it. I want to send two big thank yous out besides to Qiddist and Linda Black Elk. Michelle Marlowe is the tech person who has gotten me to do this. So if you dislike my presentations and who I am, you can send it also to Michelle. But I want to thank Michelle's been a great hand holder as I start getting used to doing things online, and really, really been very, very helpful. And I want to thank Mountain Rose Herbs. They donated a bunch of money, absolutely unasked for, to make this more available to a wider audience. So I wanted to thank Mountain Rose Herbs for that. So that's it. Nobody's asking me to make these announcements. It's not like they're sponsors to this. It's just I feel like it's important to do. All right. So the next class, I'll say this once again at the end, the next class is June 23rd. It's a Tuesday. Again, I'm asking for other voices to join this, especially Black and Brown voices, to join this discussion. If you're comfortable, just let me know. But the next class will be June 23rd, a Tuesday. I'm not sure of the hours, probably sometime in mid to late afternoon to early evening. And that'll be the next class. That'll be finishing up this class. And one very important aspect that I won't get to will also be post-care. There's a lot of important healthcare that goes on after the protest. I mean, you get hit by a rubber bullet, you get gassed, you get beat, you get trumped on, you just end up, you're just in a place where there's lots of people and a lot of kind of craziness going around, and that creates a lot of physical and mental health could be affected greatly. And so many people just go home, especially if they don't have a community, and all of a sudden things just are very uncomfortable for them. So it's really important if you're working with people, let people know that we can support them post protest in the various ways. And that'll be covered more next time, specifically how to do that. I want to just show you my first aid bag, and so this is just going to bring this over. This is what I carry when I go to protests. So it's this right here. It's pretty big. It's got numerous pockets. This is where I keep masks. This is all the fun stuff: masks, gloves, flashlight, lots of herbs here. More herbs, also just medical supplies. These are band-aids, bandages, and then more herbs. There's a bunch of pockets in this bag. But it's what I carry when I feel like it's not going to be taken away, because I do worry about it getting taken away, being confiscated by law enforcement. And, but I carry it a lot, and it just has often enough for just like one round of working with people. Something I'll discuss more thoroughly later is most of the times when you give people herbs or medicines, but let's just stick to herbs, like one dose is not enough herbal medicine for people. And so it's often important. So that's actually what I have this bottle for. We'll talk more about this at a future one. But when I give people medicine, let's say they're having a panic attack, or they're in a lot of pain, or they have they have a sprain or a strain, or they have a wound. Like, it's not, you just don't give them medicine there and then they're off. They need medicine for later. So I'm going to cover some of that, but basically I just put the medicines in these bottles. They're about 13 cents each. They're inexpensive plastic bottles. I wouldn't want to keep anything too long term. I mean, it's not a very strong plastic. I'm sure alcohol can dissolve it over time. So that's something when you work with people in first aid, in protests, often you need stuff. We'll talk about how to label them. All right, so I'm gonna move to the herbs and cover a bunch. You should know that I'm not gonna rush through, even though I talk fast, I'm not going to rush through all the information. I would rather cover each one more explicitly so that, rather than saying this does this, this does this, but I'm not going to cover how to prepare and gather plants. For me, that's what you can see these flowers over here. Lovely, huh? Protesters love flowers. So at least Seven Song loves flowers. So it's really important. I just told you I'm easily thrown off course here. I don't want to talk about, doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to cover each herb in somewhat thorough. I'm not going to cover dangerous herbs or herbs that I feel like beginner herbalist. I'm not going to cover herbs that I feel like you need to be a more advanced herbalist to know. So I know it sounds a little elitist, but there are herbs that are just dangerous to give people. And they're really helpful. But you have to know what you're doing, because you could do damage, just like if you were using a strong pharmaceutical without having a good understanding of it. The cup of choice of herbalists. So on we go to the herbs. I'm not going to read the chats. I apologize. I have about a half hour before Qiddist starts speaking, and they are open to looking at the chats. I get easily distracted. If you have questions, I'm really glad to answer questions, but I would appreciate if you just leave them. This is being recorded, and this will be posted in a few days on YouTube. I'll send the link. The best place to ask questions is in the comments section of where this will be on YouTube. So that's it for that part of it. So before we go into the herbs, I want to say that there are 3 ways that I dose herbal medicine. I don't really, this is a simplification of it. So I'm going to use the terms low dose, medium dose, and high or large dose. I just use those words interchangeably. So a low dose herb, when I say an herb is low dose, I usually mean about 3 to 5 drops per dosage. So not full dosage, but like an herb like lobelia, I might give 5 drops, then another 5 drops, and then another 5 drops. And I would call that a low dose herb. So generally it's about 1/3 to 1/2 of a dropper full. So that's low dose herbs. Again, I'm not going to be covering poisonous herbs. These are just strong herbs that it's easier to just do lower doses consistently rather than large doses where you might throw some, might go off. I don't really know what's going to happen. Usually it's fine, but it's just the lower dose works. So there's no reason to use a larger dose. Some plants are way more concentrated in their constituents. And so there's that. The next is going to be medium dosage. By medium dosage, usually it means between a half a dropper full to 1 full dropper full. So if the whole dropper, so you know, if you use herbs, one thing you know is that they really hardly ever fill up. Depends on the elasticity of the rubber, the viscosity of the fluid. So, so actually, well, I don't know why it's full, but when I mean a full dropper, I actually mean like this. So 1 full dropper. This is 2 milliliters if you measured it. So a medium dose is a half dropper full. So about this to totally full. A large dropper full or a large dose, because remember, I'm going to be using these terms per specific herb. A large dose is going to be between 1 full dropper to 2 full droppers or more. Many herbal medicines, so I think that because herbal medicine is expensive if you buy it, and so we often underdose herbal medicine and give people drops. Many herbal medicines, Chaparral, Oregon grapefruit, yarrow, there's just so many of them. You need large amounts. I mean, a 1/4 teaspoon, a 1/2 teaspoon, a teaspoon of tincture, absolutely common in my practice when I'm working with an acute, meaning something that's just happened in its bad state at the point. So again, when I say a low dosage, I mean something like a 1/3 to a 1/2 dropper full. Medium, about a 1/2 to a full dropper, and large dose, a full dropper to whatever. It could be much more. 2.5 dropper fulls when they're full as a teaspoon. All right, I hope that made sense. And I'm going to keep on going. So there are 2 ways to discuss herbs. So first, sorry. Everything changes during pregnancy, right? So when you're giving herbs to somebody, there's often no way to know if somebody's pregnant. Qiddist potentially maybe can talk about this as a birth worker, what to do. But so you can just ask everybody if they're pregnant, like everybody, right? And that's one way to do it. But there's no excellent way because even though small amounts of almost any herb are not going to instigate a problem for pregnancy, some herbs can potentially, especially if you're giving them bottles to take with them for later. So especially if you're giving medicine, you're like, here's an ounce, here's 2 ounces, here's 4 ounces for later. It's pretty important to know if alcohol is okay before you give them anything, and if they're pregnant. If they're taking other drugs, that's a whole other topic that I'm going to skip over right now. So there's 2 basic ways to discuss herbal medicine, and they are, you can either cover it by categories, like anti-inflammatories, herbs for pain, skeletal muscle relaxants, or you could discuss the specific herb and how to use that. In this class, I'm going to go with the latter. I'm going to talk about specific plants and how I use them and why I use them in protest medicine, in first aid. I do a lot of first aid that's not protest. And so there's a lot of crossover. And when I do first aid in places that are not protesting, often there's still lots of law enforcement. So there's still the problem of dealing with people that might look at me and my patients askance, and people can get arrested. So here we go. Remember, if you don't take these notes, that's fine. This will be recorded, and so you can always listen to it at a later time. All right. So the first herb that I'm going to cover is anemone. So anemone is also called pulsatilla. That's another name for the plant, both scientifically and common name. And anemone, to me, is just like one I would have in any first aid, any protest medicine bag. And the reason for it is that anemone is one of the best herbs to help counter panic and anxiety attacks. So these in protest are very, very common. People who often experience them have exacerbations of them during protests, and people who've never had them can have their first panic attack. And so basically a panic attack is a sense of feeling anxiety to the state of being so overwhelmed that you're incapacitated. It feels like you cannot function. You're frozen in fear. So everybody who's ever had one knows exactly what I'm talking about here. They're very common, and they're difficult because the person might want to function. Maybe they were just hurt, maybe they were just triggered, maybe they were just beat. And so you have physical pain, but often you have trauma associated. So anemone tincture is the kind I use. Again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of which anemones. I cover it. I have lots of handouts on my website, sevensong.com, handouts. You got lots of stuff. I write about anemone regularly because it's so explicit in what it does. It's a low dose herb. I usually give it 5 drops per time. So if somebody's having a panic attack, first, is alcohol acceptable? Alcohol is acceptable. About 5 drops in their mouth directly. It's usually given directly in a protest because it's hard to carry jugs of water. I mean, you have to have some water on you, but so there's a lot more to this. But I usually just give them 5 drops directly in their mouth and just ask them how they feel. If they say they feel a little better or no different, I'll probably try another 5 drops, and I'll keep doing that until I reach a level where there's no change. It might be 4 or 5 times into it. So in other words, they might have up to 20 drops. So anemone, this is not, I'm going to just keep holding this bottle up. It is lobelia. So, but I'm going to just keep holding the same bottle up. So anemone is really helpful for panic attacks. And I would just suggest every first aid kit have them. Panic attacks happen really commonly in first aid because first aid is basically a street protest, street medicing. I mean, the difference between that and chronic care is you weren't expecting it and now it's happened. And so this new event that's happened, you got clubbed, you got pushed, you got punched, you've got emotionally triggered. All these things happen at protests more and more. And so having this, it won't take pain away, but it just helps reduce the panic through mechanisms that I have no idea what they are. So anemone is useful. The only way I use it is in tincture form. So it's a problem if the person doesn't drink alcohol. I don't have a backup of it. I've tried some other forms. I've made them, but I haven't given them to people. So I don't know how effective they are. Mostly I've just used tincture, which I would never use if people don't take alcohol. The next one on here is just an anti-inflammatory compound. Inflammation happens through almost every single injury, whether you sprained or strained yourself, somebody pushed you to the ground, you were stepped on. So things that can easily happen at a protest that you want anti-inflammatories. If you just take anti-inflammatories once, they don't do very much, especially herbal ones. So these are not as strong as steroids or prednisone, but they do have anti-inflammatory effects. Inflammation is your body's natural response to injury, all injuries. Inflammation is what your body does in response. It's not an external factor, it's an internal factor. So anti-inflammatory, I just want to say that it's nice to have a combination. I'm going to mention some specific anti-inflammatories, but what I want to say is that it's nice to have a combo for them. Anti-inflammatories come in both internal and external preparations. So if you sprained your ankle or you got hit on the back or the head or anywhere, often it's important to put the anti-inflammatory topically. So the best forms of herbs topically, the best combinations of herbs topically for anti-inflammatories include liniments, oils, salves, and compresses. All these were discussed in the previous class. Some of the herbs that you can use topically would include Arnica, St. John's wort, black birch, willow, wintergreen, ginger, and turmeric. I know that ginger and turmeric are the most common, but I don't find them as strong as many of the other herbs that I mentioned. So all of those herbs could be put into isopropyl alcohol or into an external preparation and applied topically to the person's body. Liniments are the ones I use the most in this because in these situations, often there's a lot of energy and a lot of chaos and maybe police brutality happening right in front of you. And so like you want to help that person, but if the chaos is there, you want to move them out of the situation and then get them to a clinic if there's a set up clinic. If you've looked on the news recently, one of the street clinics was broken up by law enforcement. Things to spend just broken up. Most of the street medics got out in time to not get arrested themselves, but that happens, as I talked about previously. So those are some of the forms. Again, liniments, oils, salves, compresses are some of the external forms. I don't have a handout. I do have a handout for this. I don't have the handout that I'm saying. Eventually, I'll get this online. Next, anti-inflammatory internals. So as important it is if somebody gets injured to give them external applications. One thing you can do generally in a protest situation where there's a lot of craziness happening around you is to give it to them internally, at least start the process of reducing inflammation. You're not going to stop all inflammation. You don't want to stop all inflammation. You don't heal unless you get someone inflamed. Inflammation causes a cascade of cells in your body to come and do repair. Inflammation, again, is a natural response to it, but also if you reduce some of it, you're more mobile and more functioning. So, so then we have some of the internal herbs. If you're going to give anti-inflammatories internally, some of the best preparations are tinctures, teas. I don't carry teas to into the scrum, into like chaos. It's just a lot to carry. They're heavy, but maybe Linda can talk about it. Standing Rock. One thing we always had was like three of those 5-gallon jugs that hold heat into them and made tea so everybody can drink tea. So if you have a clinic, you have a place where you can have tea. So very useful because tea is like the safest form of herbal medicine, right? Unless you put dangerous herbs in it. So internally, you have tinctures, teas, glycerites, plants in a glycerin base, capsules, and then powders. Powders are plants stirred in water, so most of you are just going to give capsules. So these are internal preparations for inflammation. Some of the internal ones are similar to the ones I use externally with just a few exceptions. So again, I'm talking about anti-inflammatory herbs and some of the for internal use, and they include black birch, chamomile, which is really nice because it's sold in so many stores, and it's really a nice anti-inflammatory. Willow, which is in the United States, almost if it's wet, you almost always have willows throughout the whole country and throughout other countries. So in the Northern Hemisphere, so willows are very helpful because often you can gather them. Of course, in the middle of a city, I wouldn't gather plants because they're probably they're pulling up stuff from the roots. And you probably don't want like car exhaust, it's not exact, in your medicine. So continuing internal anti-inflammatories, we have meadowsweet, ginger, and turmeric. Again, black birch, chamomile, willow, licorice, meadowsweet, ginger, and turmeric. So these are all internal anti-inflammatories. And I mentioned through the form, so they're good for any injury. The next one is an anxiety formula. So it's important to differentiate anxiety from sedation. There's a lot of overlap in them. So some plants like hops in small amounts can help reduce anxiety, but hops in large amounts Could be a sedative. The advantages, there's advantages to each. So generally an anti-anxiety plant, which I'm going to just call a nervine, kind of helps settle people and reduce anxiety, but without bringing them so far down where they're not as functioning. You know, it's the classic, don't operate a car, don't operate, you know, heavy machinery. That whole aspect, sedation, is problematic if you're in a wild situation and you need to get out of it. So I'm saying this again. There are two closely related groups of herbs, and they're herbs for anxiety and herbs that are sedative. Some herbs that are good for anxiety are never really sedative, unless you just take, I don't know how much you would have to take. And then other herbs that are sedative in small amounts help with anxiety, but larger amounts decrease mental functioning. So what I'm saying first is this is just an anxiety formula that is not sedative. And I'll try to cover the individual plants later, but to name a few relaxing, non-sedating herbs that you take internally would include things like rose. Here we go, rose petals, yum, yum, yum. Damiana, anemone, tulsi, and all basils really. Tulsi basil is the most famous, but actually almost all basils are relaxing. Kava kava, which sits on the borderline. Too much of it, definitely sedating. A little of it, though, relaxing. Lavender, small amounts internally. And oat straw. So again, rose, damiana, anemone, tulsi, kava kava, lavender, and oats or oat straw are all relaxing agents. That could be really useful in these situations. Again, it's not going to really, I mean, there's always a chance. Every herb has a potential of decreasing a person's mental capacity or having a negative effect. In general, I haven't seen it with these herbs. I give lots and lots of them. So in this is a formula that you would have that would have a number of these. It's nice to have a couple of prepared formulas. The way to give this would either be tincture, tea, glycerite, powder, and capsules, all of them. Capsules take a while before they affect you, because if you take a capsule, it has to break apart, and then without a fluid in it, it takes longer to get absorbed, and so often it takes them longer. So they're really nice to take throughout the day if you're prone to anxiety, but not as useful if the person's like, I need to relax right now. Then a tincture or a glycerin or a tea are usually quicker acting than those. The next is Arnica. So I'm back to single herbs for a little while. Arnica, so don't use it. There are ways to use it internally that I don't suggest at all unless you really know what you're doing. So we're just going to talk about external uses of Arnica. Arnica is one of the best anti-inflammatory herbs for acute inflammation. In other words, inflammation that just happened right then and there. As opposed to chronic inflammation. Like if you have chronic back pain, I don't find Arnica very helpful, but if it just hurts right then, or you hurt your back, you picked up a heavy bag to run, you picked up a human being, and you're helping them, that could be really hard in the back, and really helpful, but really hard in the back. And then your face does that, you hear that noise internally, and like, so that's basically, you know, you could have pain for a little while. Anti-inflammatories can help, and Arnica is probably the most helpful. The way to use it, I'll get to internal ones, but the way to use Arnica is really putting it externally. So I made a little bit of a mistake here. I'm not going to really take it back. Usually that kind of twisting, that's skeletal muscle relaxants are better for that, like lousewort. So I'm going to come back to that. Even though I'm talking about Arnica, I kind of went off course. Talked about hurting your back, but actually Arnica is not the best plant for that kind of back pain. Things like black cohosh and lousewort are, I'll come to those later. Arnica is better when you twist your ankles, you twist your wrists, you fall down on your shoulder, you get hit on your shoulder. Then Arnica is one of the best plants for that externally. The way to use Arnica safely is in liniments, oils, and salves. And all three of those really work great for reducing inflammation. At the same time, I've mentioned previously that there's an internal anti-inflammatory tincture or medicine. I would give that. So I would put the Arnica liniment topically on their hurt shoulder so they fell down if somebody pushed them, and now that shoulder really hurts. If they feel comfortable and you feel comfortable, removing the shirts you can, or just asking if they can rub it on themselves, a close friend of them can rub it on. You always have to ask permission. Like, this is the most obvious thing. You always have to ask permission to a conscious person if you can touch them, right? So in first aid, like, you don't just put your hand in there and put something on there and touch somebody's shoulder, right? Say, can I put this on you? Would you like to put it on yourself? Do you have somebody nearby that you feel comfortable doing this with? So at the same time, I would also give them something like licorice tincture or licorice medicine as an anti-inflammatory. There's a lot of anti-inflammatories used in protest medicine. Getting injured is one of the most common things, whether it's a rubber bullet injury or getting punched or getting batoned or getting kicked. All of those things create inflammation. Just to be extremely clear, many situations also need hospitalizations and things way beyond my skill. And so it's only if I feel confident and the person's conscious and everything clicks in place that I feel like I'm the right person for this. I'm not just going to treat everybody thinking that I know the answers to all their healthcare problems. Fortunately, often I work with people who have different skill sets. Again, that's something I talked about in the previous one. Work with people who have different skill sets. I like to work with medical trained people, nurse practitioners, nurses, doctors. Also, their diagnosis can be really excellent in these things. That's Arnica. Almost finished, not. Lots more to go. So, but I'll be stopping in a little less than about 10 minutes or so and having Qiddist speak. The next herb is Calamus. So Calamus really just has one major use here. And Calamus can be very grounding and focusing. So Calamus, Acorus calamus, there's a lot of things that this plant does. Jim McDonald really speaks a lot about this plant in ways that are way more than I'm going to talk about it now that I think are useful. But in protests, Calamus helps if you get flighty. And flighty is not uncommon, right? So you're masked up and you're street medicing and maybe you've been doing it for 2 days and you go out and all of a sudden your brain goes like, where am I? What's going on? There's all this disruption around you and you're having a hard time focusing. This is not an anxiety attack. This is basically loss of focus from too much input or whoever you are and however you respond to these situations. If loss of focus is one of the things that happens, you get flighty, spacey, ungrounded. Calamus is a very grounding plant. It's strong tasting. I'm sorry, I haven't been doing the low dose and medium doses. I might try to go back and do that in a minute. But Calamus is a low to medium dose plant, meaning that you give not that much consistently for Calamus. So you might give 10 drops. The person's like, oh, I feel a little bit better. 10 more drops. I feel a little bit better. 10 more drops. I don't feel any different. Stop it. So Calamus is it can be a very helpful grounding plant for people who are feeling spacey. I'm just going to run back because there's only a few plants. So again, I'm going to run back and just say what medium and large dosages to make sure I cover this. So the anti-inflammatory external, there's really, you can use as much as you want externally, right? As long as it's not going in an orifice, external preparations are pretty safe. The anti-inflammatory internally is medium to large doses. In order to get a good effect from anti-inflammatory herbs, you have to give medium to large doses. The anxiety formula is anywhere from a low dose to a high dose. Depends on what the preparations are and how sensitive the person is to the medicine. So generally the anti-anxiety combination formula, usually though it's going to be about a half dropper full as often as necessary. The Arnica is external, so as long as there's no holes that it's going. In other words, if they have a rupture, their skin, you don't want to put Arnica, like if they got shot and there's a hole there or stabbed or just anything where there's a hole, you don't want the Arnica going directly into the bloodstream. So I mean, these can be very dangerous situations, and I feel like I'm making light of these things. These are very serious situations. What I'm saying is, if there's a hole, don't put Arnica in the hole. Put it, if you need to put it, use it around the area that it was, because you don't want a lot directly into the bloodstream. And the next plant is Chaparral. This one is not quite as important. So by Chaparral, I mean the plant Larea tridentata. So there's a region called Chaparral in Southern California, but I'm talking about the plant called Chaparral, called greasewood. Gubernadora is another name for the plant, but Larea tridentata. This plant is internal and external use. It's one of the best plants to kill infections. At protests, I don't see that many infections. People bring infections sometimes or get infections, but depends on the duration. Like something like Standing Rock, which was there for months. I was only at Standing Rock for 9 days. So Standing Rock, though, was there for many, many months. There's still people probably in the area, and Linda can speak to this. So with a duration like that, there's lots of infections that are going to happen because people are living outside of their comfort zone. There's maybe not proper health care. Actually, there's really good health care at Standing Rock for a lot of the time. But Chaparral helps kill bacteria and some protozoas. So the bacteria include things like strep and staph. The drawback to Chaparral is that it's horrible tasting. Like it is terrible. Like I can down like almost everything, but Chaparral has a very limited yuck scale, very high yuck scale to me. It's not just bitter, it's just strong flavor. You can give Chaparral both internally and externally, but I usually just use it externally for wounds as a wash. So it's the kind of thing that's going to be back at a clinic. I'm going to work with somebody and they have an infection on their foot. They got a cut 3 days ago. Of course, they haven't been able to wash because they've been sleeping at somebody's house or in a basement or who knows where during this protest because they're not local maybe. And they haven't had a chance to change their sock. Somehow they got some bacteria in there. And now they have a massive infection or a staph infection. Doesn't have to be massive infection, probably hospitalization. But an infection, and then if you have a bunch of Chaparral tea, you make a really strong tea and you soak the foot or the infected part in the tea if possible. So Chaparral is one that I use a lot for infections, mostly bacterial, occasionally internally for protozoals like Giardia, but it's pretty strong, so I limit its use. I find Chaparral, I don't like to give Chaparral too much internally besides its flavor. There's some evidence that it might not be good, but it just seems too strong. So that's Chaparral. We just have 2 minutes and then I'm on herb number 7. I prepared like 41 herbs. I'm sorry. I'm talkative and often don't say anything during my talkativeness. So of course this will be recorded. I will try to answer any questions. I'll just end on one more herb, and then I will hand this over to Qiddist. And the last herb I'm going to talk about is chamomile. So chamomile is, it's the chamomile, it's called German chamomile. It's called different things in different parts of the world. But chamomile is a great anti-inflammatory. It's a non-sedating anxiolytic, means it helps reduce anxiety. It's a great sleep aid. So I'll probably come back later and just talk about chamomile in more detail. Chamomile is just amazing because it's so inexpensive, so widely available, and it smells good. Some people do have allergic responses, but I think I'm going to leave off there. It's going to be Qiddist for the next half hour, and then Linda Black Elk for the next half hour, and then I'm going to wrap it up in the last 15 minutes. And I'll look at some of the questions that people have sent me now and try to answer them before then. So thank you for watching. I hope this is helpful. Please send comments. They could be critical comments. They could be positive comments. They could be mixed critical and positive comments, like some kind of combination tincture. I always want to do better. And people's support and people's critical questioning of things helps me do better. So I appreciate it. So I'm going to turn this over to Qiddist right now, and you are on.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Seven Song. That was wonderful. And I might go a little under time so that maybe at the end you'll have time to touch on a few more of the herbs on your list for today. My name is Qiddist Ashé. I am in Chicago. I am a birth worker, an herbalist, a community educator and organizer, and I'm so grateful to be on today. So grateful that Seven Song invited me to talk a little bit about what frontline support has been looking like here in Chicago, and how protest support and jail support in particular can look when interwoven with herbal medicine, and hopefully give you all some ideas of other ways that you can participate and support if perhaps you are not on the front lines during a protest as well. So a little bit about my work here in Chicago. So my wife and I are the founders of Ashé Living, which is a collection of offerings for physical, emotional, and spiritual healing work, particularly womb and reproductive care. And we've been working, somewhat on the front lines here during the protests in Chicago in one way by doing jail support. So when I spoke to Seven Song, we talked a little bit, and he mentioned, it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about jail support and what that is. Jail support essentially is community support for folks who have been detained during and around protests. And I think this is one of the most important and often underrated, because it's the much less glamorous side of movement work. But really a wonderful opportunity for folks to potentially participate, especially if you're someone for whom being on the frontline protest is perhaps not accessible to you, or not where you have capacity to be right now. So what jail support looks like and what it involves includes tracking people, getting their identification when they get detained and arrested if you are at a protest, and then making sure that you know and be able to find out where they're going to be located, where they're going to be held, and then following up with people as they get released to provide information, particularly legal information. It also looks like a lot of waiting, kind of camping out outside of precincts where people are held, so that when people are released, that they can get food, water, perhaps medical care, information, and transportation. So this has been especially critical in larger cities. I can't speak to everywhere, but certainly here in Chicago, this has been really critical care and is ongoing even now, because even though not all of the actions make the news, people are continuously being arrested pretty much daily, and folks are still detained, from days ago. And so post-protest support can look like jail support. And oftentimes that means camping out in your car in front of a precinct. Here in Chicago, they shut down public transportation for some time. And so folks were being released perhaps at 2 a.m. With no phone, haven't had food or water in 12-24 hours. Some people were kept without food and water while they're being held, often coming out with injuries, either police violence related or protest related, or having other health conditions, and then not having a way to even get home. So providing transportation and care that way has been really important. And for those of you who are interested in participating, you don't have to be a lawyer to do this. It's not providing legal advice, it's just information. So some organizations to check in with are like the National Lawyers Guild, Up Against the Law, and often a lot of local organizing groups are organizing people to be out there and supporting. So how does this all connect with herbal medicine? As someone who's been seeing what folks are experiencing on the front lines, I started to think about how can we make herbal care more accessible to folks, post-acute in the middle of a protest, but as they're in the recovery period, and especially those who have been detained or impacted by racial violence and police violence. So I'm going to touch on some of the main needs that I'm seeing across the city and across cities in conversation with other organizers, and then zoom into the herbal packages, boxes that we're doing, and then talk hopefully about a few of the herbs specifically that we're using. and relying on. So one of the main issues that has been coming up is tear gas. And I do want to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about tear gas because it's used so commonly. This is a riot agent that is illegal in international warfare and yet is used commonly domestically as a riot control agent. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like and things that you can do, not just herbally, but just sort of best practices, because I expect that this practice will continue. So a few things to be mindful of if you're in a protest and you know that tear gas is being set off. First of all, it's a powder in room temperature, and then it's put in an aerosol can, and then it makes the gas. And it's a nerve agent that's a chemical irritant. So when the cloud goes up, ideally you want to get to higher ground because a lot of people will go low, but really you actually want to get up to higher ground if possible. I think Seven Song, you might have touched on this last week, but not wearing contacts to protest. Some people think that that's a protector, but it really makes it worse. So wearing your glasses, or if you have contacts on, removing them. And once you get away, removing clothes. Instead of, if you can, pulling clothes over your head, if you can, rip or tear it open, because anytime it comes more in contact with the skin, it can worsen. You know, once people, so like I'm often interacting or talking to people who are out of the acute situation, but are experiencing the impacts in the days, weeks, even months post-exposure, whether that be respiratory, eye-related, skin-related burns. So once you get to a safe place or you return to your home, aside from washing in the moment, hopefully with water, I know that people have been talking about milk, which I think it can reduce the burning sensation, but it's not going to get rid of the oil. So really water is best. And then taking a cold shower rather than a hot one. If you use hot water, you're going to open up the pores and that can get more in the body. So the first cleanse you want to do is actually with cold water, and then really soap up and scrub. And then you can do hot water after that. And some of the other practices that are helpful in sort of the recovery phase are things like an Epsom salt bath, because Epsom salt will really draw the sort of leftover toxins out, and supporting your liver, because the liver is holding a lot of stress, both our external toxins, chemical exposure, as well as the intense emotional stress that happens. So even just, you know, if you don't have access to herbs, things like drinking warm lemon water, staying really hydrated, and then, you know, liver supporting herbs as possible, things like milk thistle are helpful there. And what else do I want to say about tear gas? One of the things that I do carry and think is particularly helpful in terms of herbs is mullein. Mullein as a demulcent, really soothing to the respiratory system, and also particularly helpful for folks who do have asthma, which can be significantly worsened in the case of tear gas exposure. From what I've seen, at least one person has died due to tear gas exposure by means of an asthma attack. So this is something that, you know, in terms of what Seven Song was talking about and sort of in the moment acute work, mullein in tincture or glycerate can be particularly helpful. And then in the sort of post-recovery phase, can also be helpful in a tea form. I'm really grateful and want to shout out to some of my herbalist comrades, Ellie Sternberg and Liz. Oh gosh, what is Liz's last name? I know I wrote it down. It'll come to me. She was working with Little Herbal Apothecary, and they've been really kind to donate herbs so that we can start packaging and distributing free herbal support. So I guess the difference in sort of the in the moment care where you can ask people questions, as Seven Song was saying, is alcohol okay for you? Are you pregnant? Things of that nature. Can't really do that if we're doing just kind of giving out herbs. So the way that we've been working in order to make care accessible, especially in that sort of medium term outside of the acute moment, is to package little sort of grab and go packs that can be distributed at local sites where there's, for example, like meal and supply pickup and drop off. So whether that is at the precinct sites for folks when they are coming out, for them to be able to, they pick up their legal information, perhaps food and water, and then they can have a bag of sort of herbal support to last them a little while. Same thing, we've been, in communication with community organizations that are offering meal support and medical supplies and giving, sending out pre-packaged kits for folks. So because I'm not often interfacing with people directly, I'm particularly cautious about choosing plants that are going to be as safe as possible, and being as mindful about potential interactions, even though I'm including information on sort of how to take it, when to take it, and what to be aware of. If people are on their own, especially as herbal medicine is new for many people, we want to sort of make it as safe as possible. So some of the ways that looks are doing a respiratory support sort of tear gas tea. So I've been using a lot of mullein and marshmallow root, those soothing demulcents, and super grateful to have some more herbs sent over from Little Herbal Apothecaries that has a tear gas tea that has, mullein, marshmallow, a little bit of rose, hyssop, and pleurisy root. So I've also been making sure that those teas are in tea bags, because most people don't have access to a tea infuser. So something that they can really quickly, grab and use as needed. Another thing that we've been including in those packages is some type of burn spray. And it's nice because all of these things double as obviously herbs have uses many purposes. So for example, the tear gas tea is just a great respiratory care support, especially during COVID, and especially because, frankly, tear gas exposure, especially sustained exposure, can certainly worsen the chances of somebody contracting something like COVID because of the irritation to the respiratory tract, the increased coughing, all of those things. So the respiratory tea, or a glycerate, of mullein at the very least, and then some type of a burn spray. So something for the immediate use, for skin irritation, but also, a lot of folks, I think it's easy to sort of think about that immediate care. And for example, if somebody's, been detained, they come out, they get their care and they go. But a lot of folks, we're organizers, people are in and out of the jail and perhaps coming out and going right back to the front lines or right back to organizing work. So things that people can use in the sustained period of time. So for a burn spray, things like aloe, a nice aloe spray with a little bit of, I usually add a little bit of lavender essential oil in a small amount is helpful for burns. And then I do put a salve of some kind, although I think it's important to be mindful that in this, increasingly hot weather, the salves will melt. So I do tend to carry some, but I tend to make them a little bit harder than I normally would. So when I make them, adding perhaps a little more beeswax than I typically would, because it tends to stay solid a little bit better. One of the herbs that I like to use in the wound salve especially is calendula, especially because some of our other really great vulnerary herbs are not always indicated, especially if somebody has a deeper wound. So I've been seeing some salves circulating with things like comfrey, and comfrey is amazing, but you don't want that on a deep wound because it will seal up the top of it and leave the the inside potentially open to infection. So because I'm not working all the time one-on-one with people and I can't ask them what they're using it for, I tend to stick, in terms of our pre-packaged things, stick with vulnerary herbs like calendula, which are really soothing and wound healing, but a little bit safer to use on a variety of wound types. So tear gas, tea, and respiratory support, burn spray, some type of wound salve, and then another really big need that I'm seeing is really that what Seven Song had already talked about a little bit, which is the nervine support, the nervous system care. This is a time of chronic stress, and especially for folks, Black and indigenous folks who are on the front lines and already experiencing chronic stress due to systematic oppression and racism. And then with the added experience of being on the front lines, there's a lot going on, and a lot of folks who are coming out of high stress situations and going right back into high stress situations, which is often the case in movement work. So using some nervine support is really helpful here. One of the herbs that I use, and there's so many wonderful nervines, but one that I'm particularly right now really leaning on is Tulsi, is holy basil, because it is also an adaptogen, so it helps the body to cope with stress, modulating the stress response, and it's a gentle nervine relaxant. I think some of the things that are less known about Tulsi as well is that it's also, not just neuroprotective, but hepatoprotective as well. So it's got a bit of a liver protective element, which I think right now is just really critical, that we're supporting our livers as well, and nourishing the nervous system. Also has some anti-tussive, anti-asthma effects, so helping with the respiratory as well. Especially trying to keep this care cost effective because we are providing it for free. And I don't yet have an herbal school like Seven Song, one day. I've been trying to see like which plants can we kind of check as many boxes as we can with. And so I found that Tulsi is one of those two that has been really supportive and is generally well tolerated by many people. So, and then also immune system support, which kind of Tulsi, starts to tiptoe into that area as well. But I think particularly this is relevant, I can only speak to my experience, but particularly within the organizing community and within the Black community, the rates of autoimmune conditions, and this is anecdotally speaking, I don't know about data, but I would anticipate that is true, but I just certainly know so many more Black organizers who have autoimmune conditions, and I don't think that is by coincidence. And so a lot of folks are already struggling with immune system stuff going on, and then adding the chronic stress. So when thinking about immune care, again, especially in these sort of pre-packaged methods where I'm not working one-on-one with people, I do tend to potentially stay away from some of the stronger immune stimulants, because I don't know what folks are managing or dealing with. But I have been using also some of our adaptogen mushrooms, so things like reishi, more of our modulating immune tonics that are going to work over the long term, because as we know, this is a long game, so we need that care. One more thing I want to say about the herbal packages and the boxes is that for me and my work is really centered on making and reclaiming plant medicine, particularly for BIPOC folks, as a way of becoming our own healers and reconnecting with our birthright and our ancestral wisdom. And so for me, I think this is a really, in some ways, beautiful opportunity to not only provide this critical care, because many folks are not getting medical care either, but also to provide opportunity for herbal education. I really think about the quote, I don't know who this, I've tried to look it up, maybe someone else knows, but the quote, someone someplace said, and maybe probably many people, that the goal of a healer is to become obsolete. And I think about that a lot as my work as an herbalist, that I really want to help support people in understanding their own bodies and how to work with plants. So the way that looks right now in terms of the free herbal support is, things come already pre-packaged up. So they've got the burn spray, the wound salve, the immune support, and then a respiratory support. And then some written, information and education about what these plants are, how to use them, how to work with them, and be in relationship with them to hopefully start, planting that seed of working with plants in a new way. I think the last thing that I wanted to talk really briefly about is just to also bring to our attention the ways in which the uprising and what's happening on the front lines is also impacting folks who are not directly on the front lines, but are still very much a part of our movements and also are impacted. So one way that's looking, that's in my community, because I am a birth worker, is how this has been impacting birthing people, new parents and newborns and new families. So for example, a lot of the pharmacies and Walgreens have been shut down and are still shut down, actually, even though things, at least right now, have started to calm down a little bit. And so a lot of people can't get their medications, their formula, if they're formula feeding, things like this. And so because of that, I've seen quite a rise in the need and desire of people to learn how to relactate. So for those of you who don't know, people who were perhaps using formula before now don't have access to formula and need to feed their babies, are trying to figure out how to produce milk again, which is not an easy thing all the time. And so some of my work also looks like, how do we bring herbal care and nourishment to folks in this way? And I see that also as part of the frontline support, certainly, as we're working with people who are raising the next generation and also doing movement work at the same time. And so just really briefly here, thinking about, some of our galactagogue herbs, so herbs that support milk production, fenugreek, I do oat straw, marshmallow, milky oats, nourishing things that are building up nutrients in the body, so nettle, raspberry, really trying to support people in staying hydrated and as well nourished as possible, to help. And I've seen a lot of people doing it, even in the past week or so. People are like, okay, I guess, we can't rely on formula, so how can we do this? Do you want to oh, yes. So I think that's about all that I will say for now. If you are interested in contributing and helping us to make free herbal care for folks here in Chicago who are on the front lines more accessible, we've got some big goals to send out many more packages across the city to local organizations that are doing supply and meal pickup and drop-offs, as well as to folks who are at the precincts doing jail support. We have a Patreon where people can contribute at a monthly basis, starting at $3 a month, or submit a one-time donation to help us make this care possible. And that is, you can find us at patreon.com/Ashé Living. That's ASHE Living. And perhaps maybe when this is done and we send out the recording, when Seven Song sends the email out, I can include the link as well. If you'd like to get in contact with me, I am at asheservices.com. Again, ASHE services.com. And you can contact me through there. And yeah, I would be happy to talk more if other folks are interested in setting up similar support services in their areas and want to touch base on how that's working and how they can get started with that. I would love to do that as well. So I think with that, I will hand it off to Linda.
Awesome. That was amazing, Qiddist. Thank you so much. That was so calming and organized. And I want to be clear that this will be nothing like that.
Variety. We need variety.
I was watching you and I was just like, oh, this feeling of calm came over me. And I thought, oh man, we unfortunately will be raising the level up a little because I just can't do that. But that was amazing. Seven Song, did you have anything you wanted to say in between our talks here?
No, Linda, just let us know who you are and what you do.
Okay, awesome. I'm sorry for where I'm at and the lack of a background here. We have been out all day delivering food kits to people who need them, mostly elders, but we had a lot of other people who were really in need right now, and a lot of people who don't want to be going into grocery stores and places like that. So we have a project where we've been putting together traditional food kits for indigenous people. We're serving a 7,000 square mile radius. So it's been pretty crazy. And that's the reason I'm in a vehicle. So we pulled over so that I could visit with you guys for a little while. I'm just so grateful to my friends, Seven Song and Qiddist, for all the amazing advice that they gave. My perspective is a little different. I'm Linda Black Elk, and I'm an indigenous woman. I'm Catawba, and I'm also part Duca. And I use plants for food and medicine a lot. I work with plants a lot. And so my perspective is a little different in that I'm going to talk a lot today about local plants. Now, I work with a lot of the same plants that, a lot of the same, even non-native plants that Seven Song and Qiddist talked about today. Lavender, for example. But I really wanted to focus on plants that are local and important and native, and perhaps a little different than maybe what you guys have used in the past or have come across in the past. So just wanted to share that with you. So first of all, I want to piggyback a little bit on what everyone was talking about, because we were talking about tear gas. Both Seven Song and Qiddist were talking about tear gas. And I wanted to say that something that we have found that's very effective. We don't like necessarily, it's difficult to carry milk around with you, even shelf-stable milk, even if it comes in a carton or a plastic jug, it's tough to carry it around with you. And it doesn't really help to remove the oils off the skin. So something that we use out here is actually not just water, although we use tons of water, but water that's infused with yucca root. And when I say yucca, I'm talking about Yucca glauca. It's an important native edible and medicinal plant that grows all over the prairies and the northern Great Plains and even further south. And it's just a fantastic medicine, and it's very high in saponins, so it's really good for helping to get those agents off the skin, or at least helping to minimize the impact of that when it's on the skin. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think that this is such an important time that we're in, and an important time to be talking about all of this. I feel like some of you might be thinking about coming out to the Dakotas, because the Keystone XL pipeline is really kicking off. They have not stopped building it, even though we're supposed to be social distancing or isolating at home. there have still been many people working on the KXL pipeline. And that's going right through, trespassing right through a lot of our traditional lands out here in the Dakotas. And of course, that's a huge concern. So I'm personally preparing for that. And I hope you guys are too, whether you will be here in person or just sending herbs to support. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today too, and things that we might be looking for as people who work with plants. So yeah, I'll talk about a lot of specific herbs, and I'll come at them. Like first, I wanted to talk about wound powder. We tend to use that a lot out here. We used it a lot at Standing Rock, a lot at Line 3. We tend to have a lot of cuts and scrapes and things like that. I don't know if it's just because we're really, you know, we're always walking through the prairie and things like that, walking through the woods, you know, ending up with a lot of cuts and scrapes, but we do. And so wound powder is something that a lot of us carry on us at any particular time. And my favorite wound powder combination is the puffball mushroom, the dried brown puffball mushroom. We love to eat the mushroom when it's white and marshmallowy on the inside, by the way. But when it's dried and brown, the Lakota name for puffball, when it's dried and brown like that, is Hokshichekpa, which means the baby's navel. And the reason we call it that is because we actually use it on the open wound of the baby's navel right after they're born, where the little piece of the umbilical cord remains, to help that dry up and fall off. And so that's a really important component in our wound powders out here. We also use it for ceremonial cuts and scrapes, but yeah, we use that in our wound powder mixtures too. We also use powdered yarrow, Achillea millefolium, and powdered Balsamariza sagittata root, the arrowleaf balsam root, which is fantastic. And then we also use black walnut leaf powder, which is a really great antimicrobial as well. And you know, the puffball mushroom is not just a styptic for wounds. It's also really wonderfully antimicrobial as well. So all of those are a really great addition to any wound powder, and you guys might have your own recipes, but maybe you got some ideas. You know, something else I was gonna say actually, and that I wanted to kind of start off with when we're talking about perspective, is when we as Indigenous people, and I can only speak for myself and the lessons that I've learned from my elders and other knowledge holders, but we really view protest and, you know, these encampments and things like that, we view them as ceremony. And I think that's very important to remember and to consider if you are planning to help out. These aren't places where we allow, you know, exploitation or cultural appropriation. You know, they are places of ceremony for us. That's why we almost always have a fire burning, which actually causes a lot of burns on a lot of feet. So we always have the sacred fire burning, but we always, you know, of course, have our drums and our songs and things like that, because we view these battles, I guess you could say, whether they're spiritual, emotional, mental, or physical battles, we view them as a ceremony. So when I talk about these plants, I'm not just talking about them as you know, just resources. These are my friends, my allies. I talk to plants and they talk back to us. They're communicative. And I always want you guys to remember that the spirit and the spirituality behind the uses of plants is really important when you're working with Indigenous people. So, just from wound powder, I just wanted to go a little bit. We were talking about anti-inflammatories. And you know, just treating wounds. I love using liniments, even though they're not necessarily a traditional preparation. I do use liniments, and I use a lot of salves to treat wounds externally. And of course, we do use a lot of willow bark white willow in particular. We have a lot of sandbar willow, and it tends to be a very powerful anti-inflammatory. Sandbar willow is Salix exigua, and we have quite a bit of it out here. But we also use a lot of Cornus sericea bark, and I'm talking about the outer and the inner bark. So that's, some people call it red willow or red osier dogwood. And it's a fantastic medicine that we use a lot, and we tend to use it externally to treat bruising or, you know, any kind of soft tissue injury. And if, as Seven Song was saying, we use a lot of Arnica externally out here too. We tend to use a lot of the mint family, and I'll talk more about various members of the mint family, but you know, we have a few species of mentha out here, and agastache, funiculum, which we use internally and externally. But we also use wild plum bark. Wild plums are Prunus americana, and or Kanta, if you're interested in Lakota names. But Kanta is a really important food, but it's also a really important medicine. And we use the wild plum twigs, specifically the young twigs, off the ends of the tree, of the shrub branches, and we boil those down into a tea that we drink for lung issues, inflammatory lung issues like asthma. I personally have asthma, and I can tell you that a cup of wild plum tea works as well for me as a couple puffs off of an albuterol inhaler. So we use that quite often. And we also use that externally. We will take the young twigs again, and we'll make salves or liniments and poultices out of it to treat soft tissue injuries. So I guess it's important also, when we're making this progression and talking about various issues that we face during street actions or prairie actions, depending on where you live, breathing issues are something that we, just sort of segueing from that into talking about asthmatic reactions or any kind of lung reactions, whether you're breathing in tear gas or pepper spray, or, you're running for long distances, or perhaps, you've come across some other allergen, or been exposed to another agent, we end up with a lot of breathing difficulties. And I do use the wild plum twigs as a tea quite often for that very successfully. And I have tinctured them in the past as well. But as indigenous people, we really prefer teas. They're just very useful, but it's hard to carry certain amounts of those out with you in your backpack. But it's great to have, as Seven Song was saying, large quantities of tea on hand at the home base. We also use, of course, a lot of nettles for those same issues. So we actually make a tea, and it has quite a few things. Very often when you're working with plant medicine and indigenous people, we don't tend to mix things up a lot. We don't have very complex preparations. I remember during Standing Rock, some friends sent me some of their tea preparations, and some of them had 13 or 14 different herbs in them. And I was just surprised, because we tend not to do that out here. We might mix a few, but when it comes to breathing issues, that's where I see a lot of the knowledge holders I go to. They tend to mix these particular plants, and they're the wild plum twigs, as I was saying, nettles, Urtica dioica, licorice root. And for us, we don't use Glycyrrhiza glabra out here. We actually have Glycyrrhiza lepidota, and we use that quite often. It does not, we find, and this is anecdotal, but we find that it doesn't raise blood pressure. There aren't those same issues with blood pressure being raised that there are with Glycyrrhiza glabra. It's not as sweet, but we find that it's really effective for lung ailments. So we use that. And then we do use Calamus root, Acorus calamus. Now, I was kind of thinking about something, and actually my husband and I were talking when Seven Song was talking about Calamus Root earlier. As indigenous people on the prairie, and I would dare say all over the Great Plains, we use Calamus Root a lot. And I mean a lot. Internally, externally, we candy it in maple syrup. We add it as a spice to soups and stews. And sometimes I wonder if maybe whether or not we would have a stronger reaction to it just because we use it all the time as both food and medicine. Would we have a stronger reaction to it as someone who maybe hasn't been exposed to it very often? And perhaps we'd need a bigger dose, because it's probably one of the top 5 most common medicines used in Lakota and Dakota country. You know, like just extremely common. Everyone uses it. You ask a 5-year-old kid and they'll know what bitterroot is. We call it bitterroot in English. In Lakota, it's called sinkpe kawote, which means muskrat food, because the muskrats love to eat the roots as well. So so that's part of that lung tea. And then we also use a lot of grindelia. We use grindelia as a steam. You know, we use the little tent, put a towel over our heads, and we'll breathe in the steam from grindelia that we're boiling down. And it's Grindelia squarosa is our native species here. But we do also use it as a tea. And these days I use it as a tincture as well, particularly. And I only put it in if the person I'm working with has congestion. But which we're actually seeing with COVID-19 a lot out here, we're actually seeing a lot more congestion out here associated with COVID-19 than people are seeing in other areas. And I've been very curious about that. So we're using a lot of grindelia right now out here because we're seeing a real surge in cases of COVID-19 just lately. So that's my breathing tea. I also wanted to talk a minute about staying calm, because it's something that I personally struggle with, but also something that I think, you know, when you're on the front line or when you're a part of any action, it's something that's kind of difficult for a lot of people, staying calm. And we actually staying centered, right? Because as Indigenous people, we're taught, most of us, I think this goes for a lot of Indigenous peoples, we're taught not to be too nice, not to be too mean, but to always try to stay at the center. And so we have a lot of plants that our elders say, okay, this plant will help to bring you back to the center. One of the most common ones that you hear that about is blue vervain, Verbena hostata. And that's really, you know, I think that's a perfect way to describe it, because I always say, you know, it's not like something that's super anti-anxiety or super de-stressing. But it just always, you know, when I drink blue vervain tea, if I'm up here, or if I'm over here or somewhere out on the fringes, it just helps me to take a deep breath and come back to the center. And so we tend to use that quite a lot. We do use a lot of hops, humulus, luculus as well, but we use that in very low doses because it can be quite sedative in larger doses. And, you know, some people need that, but often we'll just put a little bit of it in. Incidentally, we use it to make bread rise as well. So if you guys were wondering what we did before we had yeast, I mean, we would use natural yeast as well, but we would use hops water to help make bread rise traditionally. But it's also mildly sedative in large doses, sometimes strongly sedative. So we try not to overuse it. But it is used also to help people stay calm. We also use quite a bit of a member of the mint family, Agastiche foeniculum, Anise Hyssop. I love it. And in Lakota, it's called Wachbe Yakapi, the leaf that you chew, because it's also used to freshen the breath. But I think that even as it was used to freshen the breath, it was probably also used just sort of as a calming, that licorice, that nice anisette flavor is just so calming and centering. And even the smell of it is really calming for a lot of people. So we tend to use that quite a bit. And then one that you guys might not use very often or might not have even heard of very much, but one of our most important calming teas is lead plant. That's Amorpha canescens. And I don't know how many Amorpha species you guys have where you live, but we have 2. And this is really one of the most important ones. We also use it sometimes for mild, just like really minimal lung congestion, you know, like if someone was just exposed, you know, maybe they had a little blow by from some pepper spray and they just, you know, they're going, we'll give them lead plant tea to kind of help calm the mucus production there. So lead plant, fantastic for those issues, but also very calming. So, and then of course, one of the more powerful ones that I tend to only use with adults and I only use very much in moderation is Argemone polyanthemos. I think the English name is prickly poppy. And so we use that one also for calming, but I would say only for a real like anxious episodes, people with real deep anxious moments, anxiety, we would use that as a tea. And we use the whole top of the plant for that, by the way, not just like the pods or anything, but we use the leaves, flowers, and stems. We do use a lot of rose. We use wild rose petals, we use rose hips, and we even use rose root. We have a couple of species, Rosa arkansana and Rosa woodsii. And then of course, Tilia flowers, Tilia americana, one of my most favorite fragrances in the world. We use that as a calming anti-anxiety tea. I'll often use blue vervain and Tilia together. I think that they work very well together. And then last but not least, another calming plant that we use often. I thought Seven Song, when you were talking about chamomile, we use Matricaria matricarioides, the pineapple weed. We use that a lot, and we find it to be very calming, and even, you know, moderately good for lung support as well. Maybe because it's calming, but we use that one a lot. Now, while we're talking about calming, I want to talk about something that, you know, in a lot of actions that are further away from indigenous centers, it's all indigenous land, right? So I can't say if it's away from indigenous land, but when you're maybe in the city or something like that, I feel like a lot of herbalists don't use very many smudges. Now, I want to be careful when we talk about smudging here, because if you are working with indigenous people, medicinal smoke, smudging, burning plants is incredibly important. It's an incredibly important part of the ceremony of protest, but it's also a very good way to help people stay calm. It's a good way to get people to be calm. But we have found, and we're so hesitant to talk about this, and I hate that. And the reason we're hesitant is because smudging has become, it's become very exploited, and it's become something that we see a lot of cultural appropriation taking place around that act of smudging. And, you know, because of that, we've seen a lot of our sage species, our artemisias, being over harvested. And of course, in California, they're seeing Salvia apiana being harvested and sold at, you know, like places like Urban Outfitters and horrible things. So I really urge you all to be respectful when you are harvesting plants or when you're offering smudge to people. Or when you know, especially if you're not working with indigenous people, there are plenty of smudges and things that people of European descent, my white friends and allies use. Like they'll make sticks of lavender and rosemary, and they'll burn those. And you know, fantastically calming, smells amazing, and very useful for non-Indigenous people. And what they tell me is the reason that they do that is so that they can leave the Indigenous plants for Indigenous people to use. And I love that. So I just wanted to urge you guys to be really careful. And if you're going to put medicines together to send to Indigenous groups, frontline actions, or if, you know, maybe you're putting a kit together for when you go to a frontline action on a reservation or near a reservation, or, you know, a large group of Indigenous people. If you're doing that, there are a lot of amazing plants that we use and that we burn. Of course, you know, Artemisia luteoliciana is one that's very important. Of course, sweetgrass is very important. You have to be careful with sweetgrass just because it needs to be harvested in a particular way. And that's true of any of these plants. Make sure that wherever you're getting them from, they're harvested properly and in a respectful way. We also use a lot of cedar. And we also use, and something that I know a lot of people ask for and we don't find very often, are the seeds of cow parsnip. And those seeds are burned as a smudge, very importantly. And all of these are used not just ceremonially, but to keep people calm and to keep people centered. And sometimes, you know, at a frontline action, I'll just walk around burning sage. You know, I'll be wearing my backpack, you know, full of herbs and tinctures and things like that, but I'll be carrying burning sage because it helps people to stay calm. And so often I'll walk through burning sage and then I'll walk through burning sweetgrass. And, you know, if you have any doubts, if you're not Indigenous and you have any doubts about what you can do, ask. Always ask first, you know, before you start doing that, just so you don't overstep. And maybe, you know, you can even offer the sage that you're carrying or that you have to an Indigenous person who's present to do that. Because, you know, that act, the smudging, the burning of the plants is very important. But you want to make sure that that's done in a really good, respectful way. Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot more that I could talk about probably when we were sort of having the planning phase of this webinar. You know, I realized, you know, all of us, I'm sure all three of us could probably talk about plants for hours and hours. But to be respectful and to make sure that everyone has time, we try to limit ourselves about the things that we talk about. I wanted to say one thing, because we do, and right now we're using a lot of OSHA. We call it bear root. And actually bear root refers to a number of different plants. I personally, if I have to think about the history of plant usage, I don't think that Indigenous people of this part of the world necessarily used ligusticums, whether it's filifolia or porteri, very much traditionally. I think that when we say bear root, we're more talking about Lomatium dissectum, and perhaps a couple other Lomatiums. But those Lomatiums are harder to find and very sensitive to harvesting. So I urge you, if you are harvesting it, to be very careful, and only, you know, take very little. Otherwise, leave it for Indigenous people so that they can use it ceremonially. But the reason I wanted to bring up bear root or OSHA is because it's an important plant right now, an important plant for lung support, especially in the age of COVID-19, but it is very sensitive to harvesting. It has already been incredibly over-harvested. So I urge you, if you are using it, or if you are harvesting it to send to someone, please do so respectfully. There are a lot of other plants that provide excellent lung support that are not as sensitive, that are not as sacred to Indigenous people, and that, you know, are not as, there aren't the concerns with over harvesting. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you guys so much for letting me talk to you for a little while.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Qiddist. So I'm gonna wrap this up. We have about 15 minutes left, but that was amazing. for all the work you do. Thank you, Qiddist and Linda, for helping all the people that you help. I'm so honored that you would be a part of this presentation with me. So one more thank you, and then probably many more. So I want to mention a few herbs, then I'll finish them up. I'll talk about OSHA later as well, but I just want to agree that I'm a botanist, and why that's important, you don't have to be a botanist to gather plants, but it helps me determine like what's a rare plant from what's a not rare plant when I'm in the field. For instance, there's many ligusticums, or there's many Arnica species, and some rarer than others. And so when people just pick them willy-nilly, or even not willy-nilly, but don't know the difference between a rarer species and a less rare species, they could be doing ecological damage. I am somebody who uses I have no Native American blood, Russian Jew, but I do like OSHA, but one of the ways that I do it is that I just get away from where anybody goes. So I don't really, saying it makes me feel like I'm encouraging it. So I don't gather that much, but I needed at the free clinic where I work, some of the people and with some of the indigenous communities. And so gathering it respectfully and just gathering it way away from anybody else might be gathering it, though you can't always tell where it was. But there's lots of plants that we have to be really cautious. And then there's plants that are really common around us, dandelion and burdock, matricarioides, pineapple weed is what we call it out here. So please be considerate about the plants. They're necessary for the environment and necessary for not just human health, but the health of the environment and the health of the animals that live in any region. I want to finish up on chamomile, talk a little bit more, and then we'll end this at 8 o'clock or whatever time it is where you are, and talk a little bit more about the next program. So chamomile, one of the nice things about chamomile is that it's reasonably inexpensive to purchase compared to many other plants. It's not that hard to find grown organically. Like lots of people, I use mostly the flowering tops of the plant. And that's the part that I find most medicinal. One of the great things about chamomile or chamomile is that it's miscible. Its constituents easily go into other fluids. So you can make chamomile glycerin. Chamomile glycerin's amazing. You can make chamomile honeys. Watch out for blood sugar whenever you put anything in honey, give it to people. Chamomile tincture, chamomile tea, and then chamomile compresses. So the reason that I use chamomile so frequently, first, it has great name recognition. And that's not a minor thing. So when I'm giving somebody a medicine, and most people that I work with, especially at the clinic, but on protest lines too, have never used an herb. And so there's comfort in knowing what a plant is and having a recognition to it. So you can call this a placebo response, but I would call this a recognition response. Seeing somebody that you know makes you feel more comfortable. I wouldn't say that's placebo. I would say that's a fact based on your experience in something. But it doesn't matter what the name is or what we call this. The reason I'm saying it is when I tell people I like to give them chamomile, often they have a sigh if they have a positive relationship to the plant, which is nice in itself. Like that already can bring down some stress. So there are three main reasons so I really like chamomile. First is it's relaxing. It's a gentle, gentle anxiety relaxing plant. And fair amounts of it could be drunk or taken in and not have any negative effect. There are some people, it's not that rare. There are some people who have allergic reactions. They have a classic histamine. They have a classic allergy response. Their throat might get itchy. They might get hives. This does happen with chamomile. Often when you look at herbs, like every herb, like this can kill that person, this kills this group of people, and often they're way overblown. The chamomile as an allergen to some people definitely exists. But it rarely causes them to go into anaphylaxis or for them not to be able to breathe. So they just have to avoid it. So you can just say this is chamomile. Is that okay for you? So it's relaxing. Tea is the best form, but tinctures and glycerites definitely work as well for relaxing. It's anti-inflammatory, both internally and externally. So if somebody sprained their ankle and you wanted to wrap it in a warm cloth with a tea that's Anti-inflammatory, chamomile is an anti-inflammatory tea. So that would be called a compress. Taking a tea, putting cloth in the tea, chamomile tea, and then putting that around their ankle. And it smells really nice as well. And it's also specifically an anti-inflammatory for the gut. So this is a whole other set of issues revolving around protests. And that is, especially if they're like, if you live there, if you live someplace and you just go out and protest and then come back home and you're not really changing your lifestyle, things tend, aside from the protest, which would be horrible experience and physically bad, I mean, you can get hurt. Aside from that, many of the street medics often come from other places to go to a protest, and then they just stay at other people's houses or wherever they can sleep and at these protests. One of the things that happens with this is many people have restricted diets, whatever it is, right? So let's say they have celiac and gluten is bad for them, or they have a special diet, they can't have any tomatoes. And then you go to a protest, and often your food choices are very limited. And so because of the limited food choices, people, or you're dumpster diving in a city to get food to eat. And so all of a sudden, you're not getting the diet that's most helpful for you to maintain gut integrity. What happens often if you eat those kinds of foods is you get inflammation in your gut. You get stomach aches, right? And so chamomile is one of the better herbs for these. I mean, when you get a choice, it's getting back to the foods that are healthy for your body. But for that alone and many other herbs that we'll cover, chamomile can be helpful because it's a gut anti-inflammatory. So also, but if you swallow gas, I mean, when you get gassed, it's not just your eyes, it's your nose, it's your mouth. If you're covered, that's great. But you can also swallow some, and that absolutely irritates your mucous membranes. So chamomile's okay for that. Things like slippery elm are better for this. Hopefully you didn't ingest much of it. So chamomile is both good as a tea, tincture, glycerite. It's mediocre as a capsule because when you take chamomile and you powder it, after a while it starts to break down and oxidizes pretty soon. Then as a compress, it's really helpful. So it's a relaxant, anti-inflammatory, and gut-soothing agent that's really common. And if there are some stores open, you can go in and just buy some tea bags, but you want to put a few tea bags per tea to make tea with it because they've been sitting in those tea bags for a while. They're usually not as strong. So that's it for chamomile. The next herb, I'm a little out of order here, is black birch. Over the past 4 or 5 years, I've become a very big fan of black birch. Oh, just the chamomile. Chamomile is medium to large doses to very large doses. So black birch, other birches work. I particularly like black birch. So that's a tree that's pretty common here in the Northeast. It's often it's what's called a pioneer tree. When a road gets put in an area, sometimes the early trees that come into along the roadside are black birch. It's Betula lenta. It's often called sweet birch. And one thing that's really obvious, if you scratch it, it is really rich in methyl salicylates, which means wintergreen smell. It is like the most delightful smell. It's like it's for us out here in the Northeast, I think it's like the best twig chew that you can find. Like if you want to do your Huck Finn thing, or if you want to, well, that's maybe a terrible reference, excuse me. If you want to just chew something and just like have it in your mouth and just get a really delicious flavor and fresh in your mouth, black birch is amazing for this. But also, that smell of wintergreen is due to the chemicals called methyl salicylate. So this gets a little bit complicated. I'll try to uncomplicate it. I think my superpower is complicating everything from simple to extremely complex, making it hard to understand. So methyl salicylate. Do you hear that second word, salicylate? That's the same word as acetylsalicylic acid. Everybody repeat after me. Acetylsalicylic acid. I don't think I said that right. That's aspirin. So salicylates are what willows have that make them anti-inflammatory. And black birch has methyl salicylate, which is another group added, so my molecular chemistry is very weak. But it's a different chemical, or it's a different molecule. And it also makes it a little bit more easier to pass through tissue. So what I'm saying is the smell of wintergreen methyl salicylate is a good anti-inflammatory internally and externally, just for a wide variety of inflammation. So gut inflammation, sinus inflammation, knee inflammation, and also applying it topically. So black birch is an anti-inflammatory for both internal inflammation conditions. So again, we go back to you just eating bad foods for yourself. You ate some gluten, and when you eat gluten, you get all bloated and you get inflammation in the GI tract. Black birch along with chamomile could be really helpful. Also, if you sprained or twisted a joint and you want to use something externally, it could be really helpful there. As a compress, the best way is to get a bunch of twigs of black birch. It's the inner bark of black birch that's most medicinal, the inner bark. But if you have young twigs, your ratio to inner bark to outer bark is, you can just use you can use the whole young twig. And you can just make strong teas with that and then make a compress or a soak for joints, or you can drink the tea. One thing I use a lot of is I use black birch essential oil. I don't ever buy wintergreen essential oil. I rarely have it because wintergreen, which is the smell, and the smell is named after it. Wintergreen is a small plant that in order to make essential oil, you have to kill a lot of plants to make the essential oil. All essential oils, all essential oils take a lot of plant matter to make them. They're just very concentrated products and sometimes not so great for the environment from where they're gathered from. But black birch, at least, compared to the wintergreen plant, which also has methyl salicylates, the black birch tree, from a tree, you can get more essential oil than cutting down lots of small plants. So what I'm saying is, I use black birch essential oil if I buy it because I think, I haven't really checked that thoroughly into it, that it's more sustainable as a harvest. So I often add black birch essential oil. Let's see if I can find this quickly. Into the this is called trauma oil, but into the anti-inflammatory oils that I make to increase the efficiency of the oils. So if I'm using an external anti-inflammatory oil, we talked about those. So I might have, or liniment, it might have St. John's wort and Arnica and willow in it. And then I'll put a few drops of black birch essential oil. I usually use about 3 to 5 drops per ounce to make it pretty strong. This is not to be taken internally. I don't recommend taking essential oils internally. I think that some of the companies that push that don't have great, what's the word? I don't really care for their agenda. I think that they're making some big claims. So there are times to use some essential oils internally, but you gotta be cautious because essential oils go through all tissues very fast. So that compromises the tissues. So there's, of course, times to use it, but there's a couple essential oils. All right, I'm gonna stop. Be cautious ever using essential oils internally, but externally, they're pretty safe to use. And so I like to use black birch essential oils in my anti-inflammatory oils to increase their efficiency. And also it makes them smell delightful if you like to smell black birch. So I think that's a lot of what I wanna cover for today. I again want to thank Qiddist, who I've just met and hope to meet sometime in person, and Linda Black Elk, an old friend of mine, for contributing to this. Next class, June 23rd, Tuesday, I'm looking for other voices. Some of the folks who have been here might speak again. They're excellent speakers. But also if you're a person of color out there, indigenous person, who's frontlining at the protests or have something to offer, and you feel comfortable with me as the presenter, please let me know. I would really love to hear more voices. I think having Qiddist and Linda here really increases the value. I can't say this good enough. I just want more voices. I want to be supportive myself. Of course, obviously, I like talking some of the time, but I really like sharing this and collaborating with others so that we can make this world a safer place for BIPOC people, which has never been. And increasingly, we can see that on videos and other places. So that's it for me for now. I want to thank everybody, and I want to again thank Michelle Marlowe And I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments section. Bye, Linda. Bye, Qiddist. Bye, Michelle. And
Bye.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Wait, do you have any last words? Last words. Do you have anything you want to say, Linda or Qiddist, to add to this? No last words, please.
No, thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.